All right, welcome everybody to today's webinar. As you all know, we're going to be talking about de minimis. We're going to try to cover some of the ways that de minimis can impact your company, as well as what updates have been announced, what has changed, all of that. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right in just to make sure we don't take up any more of your time than we need to. So on today's presentation is myself. My name is Meredith Lambert. I am the marketing manager here at Trade Risk Guarantee. I help, craft a lot of content for all of us, or for all of you guys, to keep us all up to date on what's going on with kind of the chaos of the moment. Also joining us is Rachel Bauman. She is our underwriting and claims manager at Traders Guarantee. She is pretty instrumental in also kind of helping create a lot of this content and a lot of these updates for all of you. And of course, today's presentation is presented by Traders Guarantee. We are originally based in Bozeman, Montana, beautiful Bozeman, Montana. A lot of us are now kind of fully remote all around the country. But Montana is still our roots. We've been in business since 1991, and we operate on a direct-to-importer business model. So getting your bond and cargo insurance kind of directly from the experts that know the products. Sorry, my brain's all over the place with all this de minimis talk. So a little bit about Traders Guarantee. We take education very seriously. We like to keep everybody up to date on what's going on and kind of help peel back the curtain on the bond, really, something that a lot of people don't talk about. Now, of course, you can find us on YouTube. This presentation will be available on YouTube after probably as early as tomorrow, or I should be able to have it up by tomorrow. So if you need to look at this or share it with anybody else within your company, you can find us on YouTube. All of our webinars are there for free. We also post a lot of other educational content, as well as we kind of started a discussion series where we try to talk about some of the announcements that come out in a less formal way, so that we can kind of get some more discussions out there without it always having to be a webinar. So you can find all of that on YouTube. You can find us at Trade Risk Guarantee -TRG if you search directly on YouTube. Of course, I'll be sending out a link in the follow-up to this webinar. And as a quick reminder, today's webinar is for educational purposes only. This does not constitute legal advice. So, we really want to start discussions, have those discussions with you guys, the importers or brokers, and kind of encourage that back and forth. Now you can submit your questions in the Q&A of this interface. So we will try to get to all of the questions that we can at the end of this presentation. If there's any that we're unable to answer, we always like to try to look into those after the presentation, try to reach out personally to get those answered. As kind of a disclaimer, there are going to be some questions that we're just not able to answer. For instance, a lot of times in these webinars, we get questions that are very specific to your scenario. In those events, we'll try to look into things as much as we can, but sometimes the answer is that you just have to talk specifically to your broker or to your service providers to find some of those answers. So again, we're going to try to answer as many as we can. All right, now let's jump right in. We're going to kind of start with some basics. I wanted to make this presentation wholesome for anybody that doesn't really know that much about de minimis. So we're going to kind of start with what is de minimis, a quick little bit on what de minimis is. So de minimis is a Latin term. It's short for, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation because I did not take Latin, de minimis non curat lex. Probably that was awful, but it is a Latin phrase meaning the law cares not for small things. So in general, de minimis is a term used throughout many industries to refer to items and legal moments that the government feels are too small for the government really to care about. Not care about, but to have to put that time toward. Now, in international trade specifically, de minimis, the de minimis threshold is the value of a shipment that can be imported without the payment of customs duties or taxes. Now, each country has a de minimis threshold. So this is not just a US thing. Sometimes, especially being based in the United States, we tend to think a lot of this is only the US, but each country has a fixed de minimis threshold. Now, in 2016, the de minimis threshold in the United States was raised from $200 to $800 in order to facilitate trade and save on enforcement costs. This change meant that the US had one of the highest de minimis levels in the world. So, for reference, in 2024, the de minimis threshold in Australia was $673. In the EU is $166, and in Japan it was $71, and that's all been converted to US dollars from that local currency. And these are the highest countries in comparison to the US. So you can see that there's a ton of countries not mentioned here that have even lower de minimis values.
Yeah, so
oh, sorry.
I was just going to interject and say that customs particularly cares about de minimis because the lower scrutiny on these shipments results in potentially counterfeit goods or illicit goods being brought into the country through these channels.
Yeah, and we tend to also, again, right now is a really heightened time where a lot of focus is on international trade, and we tend to think, why are these changes happening and things like that. De minimis has been a topic of conversation beyond just the current administration. So even in the Biden administration, there was talk about reducing the de minimis threshold or making changes to de minimis. So this has been something that we've kind of been waiting, with bated breath to see what was going to happen. Now, these changes, we'll get into what the changes are, might be more extreme than what we originally thought, or, that's kind of up to your personal opinion. But in general, de minimis is something that a change was happening one way or the other kind of for months. Now let's kind of get into a little bit about how de minimis has historically been used, a little bit of the history of de minimis. Now, utilizing de minimis has really been instrumental for e-commerce marketplaces. And this is a big reason why we saw that shift in 2016. We saw the increase of that threshold from 200 to 800 because of the growth in e-commerce. Now, these companies use de minimis to kind of forego US warehousing and instead ship items directly to consumers from the country of origin. So this is a lot of times just called drop shipping. So a lot of these companies are using de minimis in order to drop ship goods directly from the country of origin to the United States. And a lot of times that's directly through air freight. I know the China to US that flight path, that is the most used flight path when it comes to these de minimis. So in general, right now we are talking mostly about de minimis from China, and that is kind of where the focus is because that is where the majority of these de minimis shipments are coming from. Now, the most frequently cited examples of these e-commerce marketplaces are companies like Shein and Temu. However, many businesses use de minimis for a variety of different reasons, including some of the following, right? So to quickly address consumer trends, I mean, this is a huge topic that we won't get into because we're not experts on that, about how short trend cycles are, how consumers want a certain item for a certain period of time, and then they want nothing to do with that item, right? So in order to address these kind of consumer trends, being able to ship goods in direct to consumer helps with that. So there's not a lot of inventory sitting in warehouses. And again, mitigating inventory over capacity. So these items aren't sitting in US warehouses for longer. Also widening the variety of SKUs available. So for companies, and this kind of goes with this last point too, of keeping costs down on new products, a lot of companies will use the de minimis exemption to kind of test out new products and kind of feel the waters, see if that product is worth having more inventory in the US. So that's a big understandable use of a de minimis. Now, another that is not as widely talked about is sending and receiving samples between overseas manufacturing and between offices. So a lot of companies think, I don't use de minimis. My company, we have nothing to do with de minimis. However, a lot of companies use de minimis for, when you're developing a new product and you want to receive a physical sample of that product from your overseas manufacturing, that one single entry of receiving that product could currently be using the de minimis exemption so that you're not paying those duties and taxes on the sample. Same thing for if you're sending samples between offices, maybe you have an office in Canada as well as the US, shipping between those two offices using de minimis, you don't have to pay duties, taxes, and fees. Now, obviously, if this is all you're using de minimis for, then this change isn't going to hit you as much compared to companies that have kind of built their company structure around using this de minimis exemption. However, that is still something to consider if your company is shipping these samples and you're used to being able to do this in essence, essentially for free, right? Just being able to send samples between different companies, and that this might be something now you have to consider, the fact that one time sending this is going to cost money as opposed to being able to kind of send things back and forth more freely. But yeah, so companies typically are leveraging de minimis for the direct to consumer parcels via air cargo. So, and a lot of this is in order to meet consumer demand for e-commerce specifically. Now, if we go back to why de minimis was originally created, de minimis was or is an exemption that was included in Section 321 of the Tariff Act of 1930. So this amendment specifically was introduced in 1938, and it was to allow a person to bring up to $5 worth of goods into the US for personal use without having to pay duties. So it was really originally intended for people that were traveling and sending back souvenirs or sending back foreign goods that they were purchasing for personal use, maybe, a chair they wanted in their house and they were sending it back home so they didn't have to travel with it. They would not have to pay those duties on those goods specifically. Now, the $5 threshold, of course, has been incrementally raised over the years until it jumped that big jump in 2016 from 200 to 800. And that was under the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. Now, part of that act was also expanding the scope of what could be shipped duty-free. And again, that was due to the fact that Americans were becoming more accustomed to ordering goods from all around the world. Now, with this, there has been an exponential growth of de minimis shipments in recent years. It's kind of staggering when we look at these numbers. So back in 2015, the number of de minimis shipments was, below 200 million. Still sounds like a lot, but pretty low when you then look at 2023, where now we've hit 1 billion de minimis shipments in that year. Now, data from 2024, not yet fully available, but that's a growth of 6 times. So 6 times the volume that it had in 2015. So this chart really illustrates how much more de minimis shipments customs has had to process every year, and really puts into perspective how that change that happened in 2016 really increased the rate that people were shipping de minimis shipments in. A big factor that made that change as well was the pandemic. In 2020, as we all know, people were ordering many more goods online and having them shipped directly to themselves. So we saw de minimis shipments, go up even more direct to consumer orders happening. Was there anything else, Rachel, on that? Just kind of the growth?
No, I was just going to mention that I know recently Customs has said they were handling up to 4 million entries per day of de minimis entries, that is a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a big reason why, when Trump first took office, he initially intended to do away with de minimis pretty immediately. And that 4 million de minimis shipments a day number is really what made that initial pause happen. And then that's why we've now seen these changes come later in the year, in May. But we'll get into that in the next section of what has changed and what is coming. So there have been some more recent changes, but I wanted to start with what went into effect as of May 2nd. As we all know, a lot of changes happen pretty quickly, and then other changes will come to those changes. So I tried to just kind of piece it down to what has gone into effect and then what has changed. So on April 2nd, President Trump announced that he was ending the duty-free de minimis treatment for all goods coming from the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong. So, and that was started on May 2nd. Now, what went into effect May 2nd was that for all de minimis shipments not entered through international mail, importers would have to file the appropriate entry with U.S. Customs and Border Protection and pay applicable duties. So if you were bringing goods in a formal or informal capacity, and you were citing the de minimis exemption, you now have to pay the full duty amount that would be due on that. And we'll kind of get into kind of where we're at with tariffs as well in a bit. Now, for de minimis shipments that are entered through international mail, the carrier will be required to collect the payment and transmit it to customs each month. Now, this shift in responsibility of making it the carrier's responsibility to collect this payment really goes back to that 4 million de minimis shipments a day number. This was the government's way of figuring out how to enforce this in a way that was manageable for them. So now the carrier has two options for assessing that duty. Either the carrier can choose to collect a duty assessment of 120% of the declared value, or a specific duty rate of $100 per shipment. And that was going to change on June 1st. On June 1st, it was going to go up to 200. But this has changed. Some of these numbers have now changed. So let's go over that real quick before we kind of discuss a little more. On May 12th, so pretty recently, Trump issued an executive order rolling back some of those initial numbers. So that 120% duty rate was lowered to a duty rate of 54%. And on June 1st, that $200 bump is no longer going into effect. So it's going to stay at the $100 per shipment. So now you have those two options, either 54% or $100 per shipment. And I just tried to roughly put together a quick timeline just to kind of illustrate that change. May 2nd is when all of this went into effect. May 12th is when that shift happened. So May 2nd, basically everything we just discussed went into effect. Collection of 120% of declared value, and that was in effect until May 12th. As of May 12th, that changed that 54%. And then, of course, that specific duty rate of $100 per shipment continues now. We're no longer going to see that bump on June 1st. So that is what went into effect and what was coming for de minimis. We now see that there isn't going to be a bump.
And just really quickly, international mail carriers are carriers like DHL, USPS, FedEx, UPS. So international mail would refer to shipments coming in through those companies.
Yes. Now, we have seen a pretty recent court case that was filed. I didn't include too much on this, but I really wanted to talk about this to kind of see what importers are doing with this change in response to this change. So on May 16th, there was a case filed by an auto parts retailer and distributor. Basically, the case is asking the Court of International Trade to hold this change, the de minimis the change to the de minimis exemption to be unlawful and halt its enforcement. They are asserting that failure to do so would force their company to largely cease operations by the end of June. So now the petition is claiming that this exemption is unlawful due to the fact that for kind of these two reasons. There's actually more than two reasons listed here, but the de minimis statute does not authorize the president or any other executive branch official to suspend or eliminate the exemption by administrative fiat. And that they feel it is arbitrary and capricious in violation of the Administrative Procedures Act because it ignores the impact on those that rely on the exemption, and that they failed to consider the related economic costs and benefits and did not take reasonable alternatives into consideration. They feel that it has no articulated or apparent link to the problem the government has cited as justification. So this court case has been filed. Obviously, there's been no movement on this case at the moment. But this is an example of how some importers are taking some action that they feel is necessary. However, it's important to keep in mind that while this action is taken in order to stop an increase in cost, filing a court case is on its own costly, right? You need trade attorneys, and there's a lot of downtime, which, I'm sure Rachel can talk about.
I mean, the 301 court cases that were filed back in 2018 are still ongoing and have had no decisions made, really. So if this is an avenue you're thinking about pursuing, it's important to note that if you want to continue importing, you're still going to need to remain in compliance with customs, which means paying any applicable duties, taxes, and fees owed. So it's, I expect it to take a while. We'll be watching this closely just to see how it shakes out, but.
Yeah, and that's such an important thing to note too, where in the beginning of this, they state that this could cause their company to close by the end of June. Mm-hmm. Well, in the interim, they still have to be compliant with customs. So if they're planning on continuing to operate as they have, there's not going to be a decision by the end of June on this. Now, obviously, they're trying to create a sense of urgency in their petition, but it is just important to keep that in mind, that sometimes these filing of court cases is kind of seen as a Hail Mary. Let me just get this in. Maybe this will save this situation, when in reality, you have to be prepared for that long term, kind of the long haul of going through this situation. However, if this is something you feel is necessary to pursue, we have also seen that, feedback from the industry and from the trade on these topics sometimes does kind of affect change in that way, where we've seen some things get rolled back. So, I mean, it's always a little bit of a gamble, but it is something to keep in mind, that this is an avenue. Just make sure you're ready for kind of the long fight, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So now let's kind of go over just some of the other tariff updates that came with this announcement. I'm going to really focus on China, since this is all really, talking about goods coming in from China. So we're just going to stay on that topic, since we could do a whole other presentation on some other things, and we potentially will be in the coming months. Now, with that May 12th announcement, along with the decrease in the de minimis amount, we also saw a reduction in the reciprocal tariffs on Chinese imported goods. It is now going to be that 10%, and it went into effect as of May 14th. Now, that reduction will be in place for at least 90 days, which basically equates to August 12th of 2025. And extensively, that's while China and US continue their discussions. So, right now we have this pause. It says will be in place for 90 days, but of course, keep your eye out on the news. Now, this 10% does replace the 125% tariff that was previously in effect. However, the 10% does stack with the IEEPA fentanyl tariff of 20%. So that extensively means that the baseline tariff for importing into China at the moment is 30%, and that of course is plus whatever standard duty rate your specific HTS code is subject to. But this could also be higher depending on if you're subject to Section 301 tariffs, anti-dumping, any other previously enacted legislation. But let's touch on tariff stacking just really briefly. Again, this is a huge topic and it can be very confusing. A lot of times we'll get really specific questions from importers, saying, what am I subject to? It's really hard to just blanket answer that because it is so specific to what you're importing, what manufacturer you're importing, what country. There's just a lot of things at play. However, I kind of wanted to really try to give a little bit of clarity as much as we could. Now, when we're talking about, again, Chinese goods from China, now the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs, they do stack with the fentanyl tariffs. However, they do not stack with Section 232, and that includes the Section 232 auto, steel, and aluminum. So all three of those, they do not stack with. However, they do stack with Section 301, and again, they do stack with any anti-dumping or any other kind of standard tariff rate. On the other side of that, the IEEPA fentanyl, again, does stack with reciprocal and does stack with Section 232, Section 301, and anti-dumping. Now, this on the surface looks really confusing because you're like, oh, reciprocal doesn't stack with Section 232, but the fentanyl does. The kind of shorthand answer for this is that if 232 is involved, what it really translates to is that you're not subject to the reciprocal tariff because reciprocal tariff and fentanyl stack. So that means any shipment you're bringing in from China is going to be subject to that 10% and that 20%. If the item that you're bringing in is subject to 232, then you're only subject to the 20% fentanyl and not that additional reciprocal of 10%. Now, this was a bigger, relief when that reciprocal tariff amount was 125%. But still, that's kind of what it breaks down to in the most simple form, is that if you're bringing in Section 232 goods, then you're not subject to the reciprocal tariffs. However, everything else stacks. If you want a more extensive breakdown on some of this tariff stacking, the law firm Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, they've put together a great tariff stacking chart that you can download directly from them. And I've included the link here on this slide, but I will also include it in the follow-up email to this webinar. But that's a great resource. I mean, obviously, just like all of us, they're trying to keep that as up-to-date as possible. So, if you have questions on that, they definitely can answer some of those. But it can be very confusing. So everybody's kind of trying to answer these questions as much as they can. The general answer is you've got to talk to your broker and you've got to kind of hammer in on your specific HTS code. But these are some of the kind of general answers. Okay, so how does this change impact importers? Well, the short answer is that costs will go up. And there will most likely be delays in deliveries. Now, this is going to affect businesses and it's going to affect customers as well. And I think we've all been kind of reading this in the news. Kind of like what Rachel said, right? These parcel carriers, DHL, FedEx, USPS, these parcel carriers are the ones that are in charge of collecting these new duties. So this is a new thing for them. And how they're handling that is kind of a big question. I actually would love to hear feedback from you guys on this. If you're bringing in de minimis shipments and you've already started to experience this, I would love to hear how this is going. How are parcel carriers charging? Are they charging a flat fee that, for instance, are they defaulting to the $100 per shipment, or are they going through the process of saying you owe this much in duties based on this percentage? Or are they putting that on you to figure out and pay them? I have a lot of these questions personally because that's just not something, at TRG we're dealing with, but I would love to hear feedback and kind of hear how it's going, how it's being handled. Because it's true, this is a new thing for these parcel carriers. So of course, there's going to be extra cost, higher prices for those deliveries, and that additional paperwork is most likely going to be causing shipping delays. Um, and then also keep in mind, if you were not dealing with the parcel carriers and you were bringing these goods in through an informal or formal entry and using that de minimis exemption, companies, again, that are not using that international mail that were bringing goods in, they are now going to have to pay duties that they were not previously subject to. Um, so not only is that more money they have to pay for that shipment, it's also going to be more paperwork because now those de minimis exemption entries have to be made as potentially a new entry type.
Mm-hmm. And these entries are going through more scrutiny with customs. The screening process has been elevated a little bit. Also noting, as we said, there were 4 million of these entries coming in a day that are now having to be processed differently by customs. Customs has a bit of a backlog. So on their end, you might see some delays as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of times, I know we tend to kind of get mad at customs, customs is making me do this, they're making me do that, but sometimes it is important to kind of take a step back and realize they are also just having to enforce a lot of new things that they're not ready for. I know there's been a hiring push, right, Rachel, for
Yeah.
customs?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So even there, I mean, as I'm sure all of us are feeling a little spread thin, customs is as well. So what that really translates to is unfortunately delays. It also translates into potentially more mistakes happening by customs because they're having to deal with a higher volume. You're also having new trainees doing things that maybe they're making mistakes. So a lot of times what this translates into for importers is the more transparency you can have with customs, the more you can double check that they're doing it correctly, the better. Um, we've talked about this on uh, many different presentations, but really what you can control with customs is the fact that you can double check them, right? You can't control what they have to enforce. You can't control how they're going to liquidate your entry, but you can control that transparency you have with them and being able to double check that things are happening as they should, and also having a conversation with them if you see something that's incorrect, um, to even understand it. Even if customs comes back to you and says, no, this was done this way because of X, Y, and Z, now you understand why, and you're not kind of just feeling like you've lost control, potentially. Now, of course, we are bond providers. We sell US Customs bonds, so we have to talk about the bond. And that's a big thing that is going to be impacted by this change with de minimis. If importers that were bringing in a lot of goods through the de minimis exemption now are unable to use that exemption, they're going to be paying duties that they did not previously have to pay, which is, of course, going to affect their bond. So an increase in tariffs or duties can result in an increase in your bond. I won't get too much into bond sufficiency. We have a lot of content on bond sufficiency if you want to learn more, and I can send links out as well. But bond sufficiency is calculated looking back at your past 365 days. So the duties, taxes, and fees that you've paid within those past 365 days, that's what's being used to calculate your bond sufficiency. Therefore, any spike in that can result in you needing to place a higher bond. And even if that spike is in one day, so let's say today you suddenly got hit with a new duty rate or a shipment that was going to be processed through de minimis and now isn't, even if it is this one day and that duty rate that you paid today was enough to kind of send you through the capacity of your bond, right there within that one day could mean that you're going to receive an insufficiency letter from customs next month. So it's important to keep an eye on these things and just keep that in mind. A lot of time the bond, is something we can kind of set up and not think about, kind of set it and forget it a little bit. But nowadays, we definitely have to keep a closer eye on our bonds, make sure that things are kind of able to continue to flow as smoothly as possible. And of course, we're here to help with any of that. Now, if you're a bond client with TRG, we do have tracking, bond sufficiency tracking available to our clients. This is something we do and monitor for our clients kind of in the background constantly. However, if our clients want to be able to check on their bond sufficiency levels whenever they want, we do have reporting for that. This is a new product from TRG. However, we do have free trials and things like that, so you can kind of see how this goes. And this reporting includes a lot of other reports besides just bond sufficiency, but a big one that really lends itself to this topic is the bond sufficiency report. So if you want any more information on that, you can always reach out. Again, I'll send more info in the follow-up email, but we do have that available. So yeah, so I think we can wrap this up. I wanted to keep it under an hour, so I think that's good. If you have any additional questions that kind of come up as you're kind of moving through this, please feel free to reach out. I'm going to send a follow-up email tomorrow. That should include the recording of this webinar as well as some links that I kind of talked about through the webinar. So that should be going out tomorrow. You can always reply to that email or just, again, send us a general question at askanexpert@traderisguaranty.com. We also have a blog at tradersguaranty.com/trgpeak that has some educational articles in there, as well as some educational videos and infographics, things like that. If you're looking for certain topics, we have quite a few topics covered on there. We're always trying to get more on there. Again, look for us on YouTube. You can subscribe if you want to get notice of when specifically this webinar posts. You would probably get notice even before that email is sent. So you can find us there, and yeah, let us know if you have any other questions. Oh, and also, as you guys are working through de minimis shipments, I also personally would love to hear any experiences with how this is really going with your shippers. If you're being charged more of that flat rate, or if you're more so being charged the duty rate, we're really interested in how this is actually being implemented. So if you feel like sharing, we're really interested to hear. So yeah. So again, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, and have a great Memorial Day weekend, everyone.